Okay, thanks for joining me. This is Chuck Moscowitz. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I am live streaming live here at 12 noon, Monday through Friday, at the usual affiliates or the usual suspects, as it were. And let's see here. My guest is Keith Preston. Keith is the author of Attack the System, a new anarchist perspective for the 21st century, among other books. Keith, thanks for joining me.
Good to be here, Chuck.
All right, Keith, tell me a little bit about how it is that you got involved with anarchist ideas and politics.
Well, that's a very long story that goes back for decades. I think that I first became interested in the concept of libertarian-oriented politics or anti-authoritarian politics probably around 1980. I remember that year there was a presidential election, and I remember seeing a television interview with a man from the Libertarian Party who was running for president, and I had never heard of them before. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, yeah, these people sound interesting. It's too bad I'm not old enough to actually vote for them. The first time I ever heard of anarchism was probably around 1983. I was in high school at the time, and I remember reading in my English literature textbook about William Godwin. It was actually some information about Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romance poet, but it mentioned that his father-in-law was William Godwin, the anarchist. And I'm like, well, wow, that's interesting. Never heard of that before. And then a few years later, I was in college, and I was interested in all of the usual ideas that college students often start getting into, philosophy and politics and all that kind of stuff. And I started thinking about, well, what am I politically? And I had come from a very Republican-oriented, conservative background, and I knew I wasn't really that for a variety of reasons. And I started looking at the other side of that, Democrats and liberalism, and decided I wasn't that either. So I started looking at all the other alternative points of view, and I came to anarchism largely just through reading about different points of view in generic sources like the encyclopedia. There was no internet or anything like that back then. And from there, I pretty much took it from there. I started reading up on anarchism as a philosophy and its different ideas, and then I started actually meeting real-life anarchism and anarchists and becoming involved in different kinds of anarchist groups, usually anarchist groups from the left, like the IWW. I actually belonged to them at one point. I was actually a delegate in the IWW in the late 1980s.
The Wobblies.
Yeah, the Wobblies. I was one of them.
Yep.
And then I also belong to a number of other types of groups like that, mostly student-oriented groups or more activist, left activist type groups. And then also along the way, I was still investigating libertarianism. I actually belonged to the Libertarian Party for a while. I was always interested in anti-authoritarian ideas generally. I even belonged to the ACLU, which was a liberal group at one point. Mm-hmm. This was back in the early 1990s. And then in the 1980s, when the militia movement and the so-called far right started becoming something of an undercurrent, I became interested in some of those tendencies, the sovereign citizens and all of that kind of stuff. And then through my interest in that, I actually started discovering points of view that were about moving past the usual left-right model of the spectrum, because I was always about that. I mean, I as an anarchist, I always thought, well, anarchism is really beyond the left and right model of the spectrum, because you find different types of anarchism that are all over the spectrum, and you find issues and ideas that might be related to anarchism that can be either left, right, or middle, or maybe nowhere. So I was always interested in philosophies that wanted to move past the left-right thing. And then I started discovering more of those ideas, and I started finding movements like that in Europe that had similar views, the European New Right, their positionism, all that kind of stuff. And while I never really became that or fully embraced that, I started incorporating some of that into my own approach as well. And then around 20 years ago, I started my own project that, what evolved out of it is the website Attack the System and the network that's associated with that. And that idea was largely to create a form of anarchism that was sort of an umbrella movement, more interested in meta-politics. That is, we take the idea of anarchism, we embrace all the schools of anarchism, we embrace the different ideological cousins of anarchism and issues that are relatively connected to something pertaining to anarchism. It's what I call the anti-authoritarian paradigm. anarchist historians, ranging from people like Max Nettlau to Peter Marshall, have talked about how, extending all the way backward through history, you see this lengthy trajectory of anti-authoritarian philosophies and movement emerging at different times. And they may have a very different orientation or focus, for example, we can trace some proto-anarchist ideas all the way back to the ancient Greeks and schools of thought like the Cynics and the Stoics, or back to ancient China and schools of thought like Taoism. And then we can also find similar movements in terms of peasant rebellions and slave revolts and all that kind of stuff in the Middle Ages and in the historic Middle East. And then on into the Enlightenment. During the period of the Enlightenment, we start to see the emergence of actual proto-anarchist philosophers, like if you've ever read Edmund Burke's Vindication of Anarchist Society, or William Godwin's Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, or even on into the modern era, you see Max Stirner, his the unique in its own, or sometimes translated as the ego in its own. And then from there, you actually see organized anarchist movements developing, organized around the economic theories of people like Pierre Joseph Proudhon, Mikhail Bakunin, Peter Kropotkin, more of a left, almost socialist type of anarchism. You also see radical liberal anarchism emerging in the form of thinkers like Paul Depew and Gustav Molinari. And then you see an American-style, individualistic, almost Thomas Jefferson-influenced anarchism emerging in the form of thinkers like Sandra Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, and things of that type. So, and then this whole trajectory of anarchist and anti-authoritarian thought has started to continue to build on that. In the 60s, for example, there was a wave of anarchist thinkers that emerged in places like France, situationists, and some things that were influenced by postmodernism and existentialism. You saw the New Left influenced currents of anarchism that were more about anti-imperialism, ecology, and cultural liberation, and things of that nature. Then there was a wave of more right-leaning, or at least more laissez-faire type anarchists, Murray Rothbard and people like that. And it's still like that today. And new tendencies, new trajectories keep emerging all the time. There's primitive anarchists who have a critique of technology on one hand, and then you have transhumanist anarchists that are very techno.
The Luddites, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Luddites were a tendency that existed back in the early 19th century that was largely involved peasant rebellions against the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution was having the effect of undermining the livelihoods of traditional agrarian peasant societies, as well as the artisans, the small craftspeople, and all of that. So the Luddites thought that the way to correct that problem was simply to smash up industrial machinery, industrial technology.
Right.
So it's really Ned Ludd probably never really existed. He was probably an apocryphal figure, but kind of iconic, mythical figure like, say, William Tell or something like that. There's no evidence he was a real person, but there is that tendency within anarchism, that kind of emphasis on anti-technology, anti-modernism, ecology does exist, but there's also technophile versions of anarchism as well. So you have that. You have a lot of different dichotomies within anarchism that are interesting when it comes to things like technology, pacifism and violence, religion, collectivism and individualism, and all those kinds of things.
Seems to me that the entire history of civilization is a balance, an imperfect balance between anarchism and authority. It's part of human nature that we want to have as much individual sovereignty as possible, where we don't derive our authority from the state, but the Judeo-Christian idea is that we derive our authority from an unreachable God who presents a program of morals and ethics that can't be manipulated by governments and can't be manipulated by the imperfect hand of man. So, we strive to be free in that context, and I think that in a way the United States embraces that idea. It's kind of a balance between, as the Declaration of Independence says, that we're endowed by the Creator, not by the state. And yet we recognize that, we have to set up a government, what Washington called, and I'm paraphrasing, the fearful master, that we have to bind the chains of the Constitution, down by, because it's it's government is force, government is in a way violence, it's coercion, but yet we have to bind it by the chains of the Constitution so that it can be limited and that we can maintain control of it, and that the balance of power is between the sovereign individual and the limited government, and keeping it limited while at the same time preserving a basic social fabric so that we can function, because we can't do everything by ourselves. But I want to talk a little bit about the history of anarchism, and then we'll get into the philosophy of anarchism. You mentioned Godwin. I think that Mary Shelley is a very interesting figure, the author of Frankenstein, his daughter, and married to Percy Shelley. In that novel is a warning to the world about, the artificial scientific control by people. I mean, that if we're going to have human beings creating people as opposed to being created naturally, and that there's a very dark side to that. It's a very dangerous side to it, and it shows the results of it. And also, Michael Bakunin seems to me to be a major figure in anarchist history, and he was had a falling out with Marx, but he was very much part of that system. And that gets into the question of, anarchism, which I think is natural to all of us. We all want to throw off authority. We want to throw off our own personal authority in a way and try to imagine and actualize ourselves and take a look at existence. But it's neither left nor is it right, in that it's the exact opposite, in that if the further to the left you go, the more authority you have. I mean, the left is all about earthly power, public ownership of the means of production. I mean, that's the definition of socialism, and that Marx saw the progression as being each stage with more and more authority until eventually he reaches a utopia, which he called communism, which is the one world ant colony, where we no longer have to have any hierarchy at all, no longer have any differences. We're all de facto equal, which is impossible and completely unnatural and could never happen. But then on the right, you have an anti-government tendency, the libertarian tendency, as described by people like Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard and others, where you have less and less government, and that, like Ayn Rand, only saw government as having three roles: police, the court system, and public enforcement of contracts. Other than that, nothing else, and an army. And the further right you go, the less government you have until you reach anarchy. So they both reach in the middle, whereas you have total government as a state of anarchy, communism, because man no longer has a brain and everybody's just equal and we all exist in harmony with nature, and government, as Marx says, withers away. Or you have the far right version, which is the complete reduction and diminution of government to the point where it barely, if not totally, doesn't exist anymore.
Well, you presented a lot of interesting ideas there, and you find various anarchist thinkers historically that are within these various traditions that you're describing. When it comes to someone like Mary Shelley, Mary Godwin Shelley, the novel Frankenstein, it's one of the classic horror novels, and it predates the modern horror genre. But that's what that was. It was a warning about the potential abuses of science. And it's really interesting to consider that she was writing in the early 19th century when modern scientism as an ideology was really starting to develop. And out of the Enlightenment, there came this idea of human perfectibility, the idea that you can simply improve or perfect human beings through science or through having the right social structures and things like that. That was a very pervasive current in the Enlightenment. And in the 19th century, I started to see the idea of using science as a means of human manipulation, in the sense of, well, the most extreme example was eugenics. This kind of thinking became the foundation of eugenics, where we can improve the species biologically through scientific manipulation. Right. I think Mary Shelley's ideas were sort of a warning against some of that kind of stuff that did come out at a later date. And so that's one aspect I think that you do find in a lot of proto-anarchist thinking. You mentioned the rivalry between Marx and Bakunin. Bakunin was arguably one of the most proficient and early critics of Marxism because he actually knew Marx personally. These guys all knew each other. And Bakunin's main critique of Marxism is that Marx's idea of the worker state, the red revolutionary state, would ultimately be just another kind of authoritarianism of the type they were supposedly fighting against. Bakunin was a Russian and Marx was a German. They were used to these kinds of authoritarian autocratic societies that existed in the 19th century. And Bakunin said that if you take Marx's ideas seriously, what you're going to end up with is a red czar, a guy that's just going to be just as bad as the current czar, just as bad as any of the absolute monarchs of Europe and stuff like that. And he argued that that socialism of that type, state socialism, would be in practice would be a type of authoritarian bureaucratic system, which is what Marxism in practice actually was. I mean, every
right, it's all about power.
Claimed to be a Marxist state was that kind of system. It was a one-party state, usually with one guy at the top of the pyramid.
It's all about power, and it's the use of the state as a utopian object to then bring about the next stage in human development, and which is, and they actually view the state. Hegel viewed the state as a living organism, literally, that had a birth, a primary time, and then a death. And that Marx wanted to use the levers of the state to try to implement a change in human nature by force. But Bakunin, as you say, he said that all this would result in is a red czar. However, is that not what anarchism results in if it's not put in a context of some kind of government? Because after all, authority is. I mean, we've demonstrated since the beginning of time that there needs to be some sort of an authority. The only question is, can it be controlled and limited by the people to serve the people as opposed to the other way around? And if you have anarchy, which has a violent side to it because it's not natural, just like communism, you have to, no one's going to give, in the same way that no one's going to give up their property for communism. That's why you need violence. Anarchism, to remove all government, also needs violence because people need government. So you're going to end up with a red czar in an anarchist state, and that's exactly what happened in Russia.
Well, the question you've raised is the same one, of course, that Hobbes raised, the classic question, which is the idea of, what about order? One of the primary differences, I think, that exists between various contending political philosophies is the question of order versus liberty versus equality. The left tends to be more about equality, libertarians tend to be more about liberty, and the right, traditional conservatism, tends to be about order and civilization. And I don't think any of these things are mutually separated from each other. I mean, to have one of these, you have to have at least some of the others. But there's this question of, well, how do you have order in society and rather in order to prevent chaos? And of course, Thomas Hobbes, living in the middle of the English Civil War, he said, well, liberty doesn't work. All it does is produce chaos, so what we need is order. He was in favor of absolute monarchies that could keep order and keep rival political factions from engaging in civil war and things of that nature. Now, the obvious problem with the Hobbesian view is, well, who watches the watchdog? It's the idea of, okay, you have the guy that Hobbes called the Leviathan, and the idea was he's going to be the one that keeps order, but who watches him, and how did he prevent him from becoming a tyrant? And Hobbes seemed to basically say, well, maybe you can't. That's just, tyranny is just the price you pay for order and civilization. Then out of that, of course, come subsequent thinkers from the Enlightenment era, like John Locke, for example, who said, well, it's not really enough to have order. You've also got to have breathing room for freedom and civilization. Otherwise, everything's just going to stagnate. So that dichotomy has always existed. But when you mentioned Ayn Rand, there's an important point there. First, I'll say that of all the different branches of libertarianism or anarchistic thought, the Randians, objectivists, are my least favorite, by the way. But the traditional anarchism, and I think prototypes for anarchism, extending all the way back in history, were never simply about opposing an authoritarian government alone. It's like dictators and absolute monarchs and totalitarian regimes and things like that. Anarchism was always more about critiquing concentrated power wherever it arises, or excessive authority wherever it arises. For instance, a prototype for anarchism, one of its antecedents, was the 18th century liberal philosophy. It comes out of thinkers like John Locke, and then later Thomas Jefferson, and on into the 19th century, someone like John Stuart Mill. But the idea there is concentrations of power problematic. And in the 18th century, that meant you had the royal families, the dynasties, the monarchs, but you also had the aristocracy who monopolized the economic resources and the land, and the guild monopolies, and then the church, usually the Catholic Church, that monopolized intellectual life as well. So certainly the early liberals were opposed to these kinds of concentrations of power, and the classical anarchists even more so. The idea is concentrated power is a problem. It's not just the coercive power of the state, but it's also monopolies over resources and over cultural and intellectual life as well. So I think that's one thing that a lot of modern so-called libertarians, particularly American-style libertarians, tend to miss, I think, is that concentrated power exists in a lot of different contexts. You have the Ayn Rand, like Ayn Rand once said that big business is America's most persecuted minority, which I think is an absolutely absurd statement. No, big business is America's most privileged minority, or most privileged anything. And a lot of that kind of thinking influences a lot of the modern right libertarian types. They have the idea, well, let's just get government out of the way and let corporations do whatever they want and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's that simple. I tend to have a view, like as an anarchist, I would say, yeah, I'm against the state. But I don't define the state simply as laws. I define the state as the ruling class apparatus, and that in our system in the United States would be the political government, obviously, but also the corporations, the banks, the military-industrial complex. I would say the mass media and the university system are part of that. A lot of elite think tanks and foundations and all sorts of institutional arrangements are part of this ruling class apparatus. And that is what controls not only the political system, but also the economy and the intellectual and cultural life as well. For instance, I would say the media is the modern version of the church, or the university system is the modern version of the church, in the sense that those are the institutions that shape the ideas and values that permeate the society. Just like the corporations, the mass corporations, all of these plutocrats that we have nowadays, they're just the modern version of the robber barons, or the modern version of the feudal lords that we had back in the Middle Ages. So I think that when we talk about anarchism, you have to talk about concentrated power generally, not just a formal state system.
No, I mean, now you're getting into some interesting things here, because I think in this country, starting pretty much in the late 19th century, but early 20th century, you had this emergence of what we might euphemistically call the Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment. It was the government and elements of the private sector kind of working together. In a way, it was perfected by Mussolini in Italy. I mean, where we had a council of corporations instead of a Congress. And it was, certain corporations got monopoly rights, and they didn't have to compete with others. It's not capitalism, really. It's state capitalism, or it's kind of what's going on, I think, in China today. And in this country, it's become predominant, but in a much less formal sense. And you mentioned earlier also Proudhon, and you mentioned the Wobblies, and them. They were syndicalists in that they believed that the best government ought to reside not so much with local government, because that's more of a conservative idea. It's a Catholic idea, actually, but more that it would reside with guilds. It would reside with people involved in certain kinds of businesses who would become self-governing units that would have a lot of sovereignty over the lives of their own citizens, and it would be more of a local phenomena. And I think the best expression of that today is the movement toward localism, which I think is a very positive thing. I mean, especially made possible by things like the internet. You don't have to necessarily, we no longer have big factories with 6,000 people punch a clock every day. Now you can work from home, you could work 24 hours a day, you could work anytime. And more people we're moving in a way back to the original vision of America that was embraced by people like Jefferson, where, the agrarian society, except instead necessarily of being agrarian, we have small businesses, small farms, small local industry, and it's a move more toward local control over our lives. It's a localist movement, which is very interesting, and which is sort of in line with a version of the syndicalist movement of the 19th century that was advocated by people like Saint Simon and Proudhon, and which was rejected by Marx at the Second Workers' Convention because they were more of a nationalized, internationalized, big government control, utopian, messianic movement, where as opposed to that the individual is the locus of sovereignty under God. I think in order for that system, however, to work, you need to have a moral and ethical context. You need to have faith. That has to be a part of it. It can't be something that just goes on and that you get to invent, moral and ethical standards yourself. The human being isn't the source of that. In other words, there has to be a greater authority that is the originator of law and of morals and ethics. What do you think?
Well, again, you've raised a number of interesting points. Looking at American history, I think what you're saying is quite correct, although I might turn the clock back a little bit further. If we look at the American Revolution of the 18th century, what that revolution amounted to was a revolution of what in European culture would have been called the upper middle class against the traditional elite. In traditional European societies, you had the elite, which was the royal families, the titled aristocracy, and the established church, which would have been the Church of England in Britain. But underneath that, you had an upper middle class that would have been often very wealthy, but also not titled, no royal titles or aristocratic titles. And most of the leaders of the American Revolution were from that class. They were from what would have been in Europe the upper middle class, but not the elite. They were typically large landowners, bankers, merchants, and people of that type, but not titled elites. So I tend to interpret the American Revolution as a sort of an upper middle class revolution against the traditional elites. And then the system that they created, interestingly, the Articles of Confederation was the first American government. It was rejected in part because it was considered to be too populist or too democratic. I think the elites wanted to create a system, a new system, that would largely be a type of class dictatorship in the sense that this, rising industrial, merchant, banker class, and planter class as well would be the ruling class of the new American Republic. Now, within that framework, there was always a conflict between the Southern agrarian interests on one hand and the Northern financial and mercantile and early industrial interests, and that's really how we got to Democrats and Republicans. And that's how we got to the Hamilton-Jeffersonian rivalry and all of that. That goes all the way back to the late 18th and early 19th century. And I interpret the Civil War in that way. To me, the Civil War was ultimately a type of class war between the Southern, almost quasi-feudal agrarian interests on one hand. And I think the South was probably more akin to a traditional European society than the North. In many ways, I think the South more closely resembled the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Latin America than it did the English colonies. I mean, that's a rough comparison. But I see the Civil War as a conflict between Southern agrarian, quasi-feudalism, or what may be early capitalism, early agrarian capitalism, versus Northern industrial, mercantile, financial capitalism. And ultimately, it's the North that gets the upper hand for a variety of reasons. And then that creates the pretext for the Industrial Revolution that happens in the late 19th century. And then the emergence of the robber barons as this new industrial ruling class that in turn colludes with the state. Like around the time of the Progressive eras, which you're referring to, the late 19th century, early 20th century, you start seeing the robber baron types actually colluding with the state in order to create this kind of more centralized, corporatized kind of planned economy, the so-called Progressive era, which was based on the idea of scientific management of society and things like that. That's what you start to see emerging in the late 19th and early 20th century. You see, state expansion of the state, growth of plutocracy, growth of corporatism, and the rationale behind this is this kind of scientism, this kind of efficient management of society rationalization, the kind of stuff that Max Weber was writing about in Germany at the exact same time. And that becomes the prototype for the modern ruling class that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're talking about culture, like you're talking about syndicalism and Proudhon and thinkers like that, yeah, their idea was a society that's largely decentralized, self-governing, governing based on economic associations, kind of like cooperatives, like or communes or cooperatives or workers' councils or something like that. And I think you're right in the sense that for a society to have a kind of libertarian like that system, there does have to be some cultural underpinnings for it. In fact, thinkers from the left have recognized that, like Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist theorist during the Mussolini era. He actually argued that, well, before you can really have a certain kind of political system or economic system, you've got to have the cultural foundation for that as well.
Yeah, but just to interrupt, Gramsci talked about the long march through the culture as a way of subverting the cultural system and moving it toward collective Marxism. By gaining the upper, gradually. This is what's happened, I think, with the American university. Through attrition, they've gotten rid of conservatives and libertarians. It's mostly left-wingers now because they want to gain the high ground of the culture, whether it be through academia, through the foundations, through our arts, all of our cultural organizations, music, they're all into the revolutionary left idea of transforming human nature. And I also don't think I agree with you on regarding at least the intent and the philosophy of the founders. I don't think it was class-based, regardless of which class they might have been in. I think it was set up so that there would be upward mobility and it would be a nation of small business owners and people at all levels who could be self-actualized, that rights came from the creator and not the state. It is true that most of these guys were, fairly wealthy at the time, but not all. I mean, the Adamses were not wealthy. I mean, there was they set up a society of businessmen, basically, of people who could create, and that there would be both upward and downward mobility. And a good example of that is that some of the wealthiest people in America at the time of the founding are no longer wealthy. I mean, we didn't have a set aristocratic control. So even though it's an imperfect system, at the time it was really quite revolutionary, or maybe you might say counter-revolutionary, in that it was the first time that you had a system that was not based on hereditary aristocratic upper echelon control with a king that derived his rights from God, the divine rights of king. We didn't have that. We had the individual derives his rights from God, and then the individual then through a process of republicanism gives a limited grant of power to the state. But what's happened is, as you say, I mean, starting in the late 19th, early 20th century, you had, the frontier thinkers, the so-called progressives, people like Woodrow Wilson, people like Randolph Bourne and James and Crowley and these other guys, developed this idea that the Constitution was anachronistic. They never said why, but that it was not suitable for today. Now they needed to have a corporatist state where governing powers would be transferred to unelected officials. Governing powers were transferred to, the money power was transferred to a Federal Reserve System, which is privately owned. The cultural power, because of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, gave tax exemptions to these foundations and nonprofits, which the very wealthy people were then able to transfer their fortunes to, and they would dictate the future of the culture and how things would run. Then you had, unelected bureaucracies set up, or quasi-government bureaucracies which are unaccountable to elections. The whole idea of the American system of checks and balances was that you had elected officials who then operated in a context of a constitution, not these unelected entities. And then after World War II, it accelerated even on an international level with the United Nations and with all these international NGOs, and they started coming in and basically, making policies and passing laws. They don't call them laws, they call them other things, but we find that they're taking over more and more aspects of our lives. And it's completely contrary to the American idea, which is that rights come from God, the Creator, and that we as individuals then give the government a very limited grant of power. In a way, it's a very anarchistic idea, the American idea, in that it favors an anti-government position. We don't trust government. Thomas Paine in his Common Sense. It was the pamphlet that made the American Revolution. He said that government is evil. It's not to be trusted. And that's how the Americans look at this. That's how we used to look at it. Now, of course, you have the left, which worships government. But anyway.
Yeah, well, I would agree with just about everything you said. The only partial exception would be, I do think in the American Revolution there was a class element to that, but I would qualify that by saying that the class system that developed in the United States was markedly different from a traditional feudal class system, in the sense that a feudal class system is based on ascribed status. You're just born into a class, and that's what you are, period. It's kind of like the Indian caste system. But a modern class system is fluid. It's based. There is possibility of mobility between classes. That doesn't mean there's not class stratification, or that particular classes don't influence the state. But there is a much different kind of class system in a modern, industrial capitalist society than you see in a traditional feudal system. So yeah, absolutely, I agree on that. And I agree with much of what you're saying about the cultural foundation of Americanism, or what you're saying, or as you, whatever we would want to call it, in the sense that even a lot of anarchists recognize that. For instance, there was an American anarchist woman in the late 19th and early 20th century named Voltairine de Cleyre, who wrote an essay called Anarchism in the American Tradition. And she was talking about some of this Jeffersonian cultural ethos that shaped much of American traditional culture. And there was another anarchist from around the same time named Benjamin Tucker, who had a branch of anarchism that was very individualistically oriented, cited Thomas Jefferson as a direct influence. And there were other anarchists in places like Europe, like in Russia, for example, the Russian anarchist Kropotkin, pointed to that and said, yeah, individualist anarchism is a very American thing in a cultural sense because of this, because America does have this kind of laissez-faire Jeffersonian tradition. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the cultural foundations. And also, I would agree in the sense that for a society to have a particular kind of political or economic system, you do need to have a cultural underpinning for that. And when I gave the example of Gramsci, I was pointing out that he recognized this. He recognized that for a society to have a certain political and economic system, whatever you want it to be, the cultural foundation has to be there. And that's why he was big on the left, trying to get control of the cultural institutions first, which, as you pointed out, they have over the last century or so. But it's interesting. I would say that all Americans, to some degree, have had a libertarian education.
Oh yeah, it's a libertarian country. I mean, by nature. All right, my guest is Keith Preston. The book is "Attack the System: A New Anarchist Perspective for the 21st Century." I see that it's available at Amazon. Keith also has a bunch of other books. Keith, I think that while America, as I say, we have an anarchist spirit. We are an anarchist society in the sense that we believe that rights come from the individual who derives it from the Creator and not from the state, which is the very philosophical ethos of the American Revolution. But the anarchist movement and also anarchy itself is vulnerable to left-wing subversion in that the left wants to reorder human nature. They want to use violence as a way to do that. You can't get people to give up property or to give up freedoms in order for some greater good, because no one in their right mind is going to do that. You're not going to give up family. You're not going to give up love. You're not going to give up relationships. You're not going to give up property. You're not going to give up trade. But that's what the left wants, because ultimately communism means absolute equality, which is an end to hierarchy, natural hierarchy, which is impossible. So they appeal to the anarchists and they subvert anarchy in their service. And they use anarchy to engage in violence against the establishment because they want to tear down the existing government with a dialectical means so they could create a bigger government to serve their purpose. And you mentioned Kropotkin. He was the author of either he or Chernyshevsky were the authors of Catechism of a Revolutionary, where they get in. It was very influential on the Bolsheviks, where they get into how to use anarchist violence as a way to overthrow a society. So people thus find themselves being used as cannon fodder in this revolutionary radical idea, which is anything but anarchist. It's total government authority. And it also goes a long way to explain why, for example, in this country, if you take a look at the top 1% richest people and the top, government people in, whether it be in the culture, whether it be in corporations, whether it be in economics, they're mostly people who lean left politically and who support, a harder left move, as opposed to a more conservative American, which is, a more diverse politically and who's into, basically self-interest and self-sovereignty. So my concern, again, is that anarchy is an idea and the anarchist movement can be used by and co-opted by the left. What do you think?
Well, as far as the book you're referring to, the Catechism of a Revolutionary, the author of that is actually Sergei Nechayev, not Bakunin. Not Kropotkin. Nechayev was a Russian terrorist. He was associated with a movement called nihilism, which is, similar to what you're describing. It's just kind of about violence for its own sake, terrorism for terrorism's sake. So he had some association with some figures involved in anarchism, but he's not really considered part of the anarchist trajectory or history. But that tradition does exist. That kind of terrorism for terrorism's sake does exist. And it's also true, I think you're correct, that historically anarchists have had a problem with conflict between themselves and between Marxists and other state-centric socialists and others with similar views. You saw that in the First International. You mentioned the First International when there was a conflict between the Proudhonists and Bakuninists on one hand and the Marxists on the other. And the Marxists favored this kind of French revolutionary version of socialism, this kind of Jacobin-influenced socialism, where it's all about seizing control of the state and imposing a revolutionary dictatorship, and then expanding this, kind of a leftist imperialism, which is what Napoleon was doing back in the early 18th century. And the Marxists eventually became that. And I think that you're absolutely correct about that. In fact, I've had some long-standing debates with a lot of anarchists about this. One issue like that now that's prominent is the question of these people called the Antifa or the Antifa.
I was going to ask you about that.
What I see the Antifa as being is exactly what you're describing. I think they are a movement of hard left, fanatical, messianic, Jacobin ideologues that are trying to co-opt the name of anarchism or the name of radicalism generally to advance an agenda that's just as bad as anybody from the establishment promotes. So there's always been this problem that anarchists have had, and that is co-optation from the hard left. Whether it was Bolshevism or Marxism-Leninism, or whether today is something like the Antifa, and there's other issues like this as well. So I don't think we would really be in disagreement with that. In fact, I have spent a lot of time over the last 20 years, a lot of ink and a lot of bandwidth, criticizing anarchists who fall into this trap, and I'm widely reviled by many anarchists or some anarchists for pointing these kinds of things out. But yeah, I mean, as I see it, anarchism is a type of radical centrism in the sense that just as it's opposing the establishment, the state, the ruling class, or whatever, there's always the danger of co-optation or infiltration or suppression by extremists from the far right or the far left, whether it's communists or Antifa or similar tendencies from the left or also from the right. There's also there's also fascists and national socialists and all of that kind of stuff as well. Mm-hmm. So that I think is really, in terms of trying to build a movement and organize, that's one of the main things that anarchists need to guard against. While attacking the establishment, they also need to guard against the potential co-optation by either the far right or far left by building a very distinctive identity for anarchism that's independent of these kinds of things. A lot of anarchists are, on one hand, they're hysterically anti-fascist. They're Antifa, the most obvious example, but they seem oblivious to the idea of co-optation or infiltration from the left, which actually historically has been more of a problem for anarchists than the other way around. I don't know that we would have any disagreements on this basic issue. And as far as the elites, I'm talking about the 1% and all of that, I think the vision of the 1% is they're certainly on the left in a sense that they are cultural leftists, and the reason for that is because what they envision is a global system where markets and trade and the economy and all of that is integrated across national borders. They are, they're very much for the global economy. They're the main people who benefit from it. Mm-hmm. And parallel to that, they want to have international institutions that are set up to manage the global economy and manage the world order under their leadership. And that's why we've got the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, the EU, the United Nations.
Right.
And we could just keep NATO, and we
sure,
just keep
it's a creeping world order. But so if you were to, I mean, in a sense, this is the great paradox of anarchy, which is that, by nature, anarchists are individualists, they're localists, they don't want to have government control over them and the way they conduct their lives, and they want to control, to the highest degree possible, their own lives and their own destinies. And yet, you're talking about some kind of a unified ideal or idea of anarchism. And you mentioned pan-secessionism in your book. What is that about, and where do you think anarchy today is, and what role can it play both in the United States and around the world?
Well, pan-secessionism is a tactical concept. It's not an ideology. Like, I've had people confuse it with an ideology. They say, well, what are the basic tenets of pan-secessionism? And I'm like, well, there aren't any. I mean, that's like saying, what are the tenets of voting, or what are the tenets of signing a petition, or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's a tactical concept. Now, a lot of people also confuse it with something like mere political secession. Certainly, political secession could be a part of pan-secessionism. For example, you may have regions that break away from larger nations and things like that. Like the 13 colonies broke away from the British Empire. The South tried to separate from the North, or Czechoslovakia became the Czech Republic and Slovakia and things like that. So that mm-hmm. kind of thing could be a part of pan-secessionism. But there's also the idea of dissociating yourself from the system in a wider sense by building has commonly been called dual power, or alternative infrastructure, or counter economics, all these different kinds of ideas where you're actually building an alternative infrastructure to state systems and to systems that are dominated by the establishment. And that includes not just politics, but it also includes economics, culture, education, media, all kinds of other things.
Sure.
Like what you're doing is part of pan-secessionism,
right? Because
you're doing alternative media. You're not part of the establishment media. You're not on Fox or MSNBC or CBS or ABC or whatever.
Sure.
You're building alternative media, promoting alternative ideas. So that's what pan-secession is. It's about building this kind of alternative cultural, political, economic, educational, whatever infrastructure in a way that eventually supersedes the ruling class institution. The Wobblies had an idea for this. They called it building the new society in the shell of the old. And that's what more or less pan-secessionism is, a modern version of that, or a modern version of the old syndicalist idea of the general strike. Now, also the idea in terms of, do we have to have a unified ideal? This is another debate that I have with some anarchists, because there are some anarchists that, as one anarchist I know once referred to them as world domination anarchists. This idea that there has to be some universal system or some universal idea, and I would say no. To me,
sounds like a contradiction in terms.
Right, exactly. To me, anarchism, like there's a quote from Anthony Sutton, who he was, as far as I know, didn't identify as an anarchist, but he might as well have been, because I think he had some really powerful insights into some of this stuff.
Oh yeah, America's Secret Establishment.
Exactly.
Great stuff.
And,
Yeah.
I'll mention the quote first. There's a quote from Anthony Sutton where he says that basically the alternative to the system is things like voluntary associations, voluntary communities, local self-rule, decentralized societies. That's what anarchism is, to me at least. And and Sutton, I think, was also very interesting in the sense that he understood that American-style state capitalism and things like fascism and communism are all different points on the same triangle.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't so much enemies with each other as much as they were interconnected with each other. And their rivalries were intramural rivalries. I think that's an aspect of Sutton that's very important. But but within the framework, though, of what someone like Sutton is describing, decentralized societies, voluntary communities, voluntary associations, local self-rule, that creates the infrastructure, the framework for an infinite variety of diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean real diversity. Like we hear, it's a shame the way that political correctness and all of that has given the concept of diversity a bad name. Because what they do is what PC does is it reflects the ruling class values in the sense that, well, they mean diversity because they want to sell consumer products made in China with slave labor to lots of different people with different skin colors and sexual orientations, or they want to be able to utilize the labor of people of lots of different skin colors and genders and sexual orientations and all that. So that's why, for example, they're so big on mass immigration and breaking down barriers between nations and stuff like that, because it's all part of integrating everything into this global hegemony.
And they're against the sovereign nation state.
Exactly.
Which they view as an old-fashioned thing.
They're against sovereign anything.
Sure.
The sovereignty they favor is their own. I mean, they envision themselves as the Hobbesian Leviathan. That's what they aspire to. But
all under the garment of science.
Under this kind of technocratic scientism. Yeah, that's like the new religion or the new theocracy or something like that.
And they use a lot of quack science, we may add. That's a whole different subject, but it's an interesting one.
And so anarchism is by definition decentralized, voluntary, pluralistic, and diverse, and that can include all kinds of things. I am totally opposed to any kind of one-size-fits-all approach to anarchism. I, for example, believe that with anarchism, yes, you can have communities and institutions that do reject things like technology, like the Luddites. Like you have the Amish, for example. They're a good example of that. It's a group that actually practices this. Mm-hmm. Or you can have religious, sentiment-oriented communities, like, say, the Mormons or whatever. Or you can have hippie communes, or you can have vegetarians, right. Or you can have diversity.
As long as they're not imposing it on someone else, it's voluntary.
Exactly.
Right.
To me, that's what anarchism is.
Sure.
And regrettably, you do find people in anarchist circles that don't really seem to understand this. And I've spent decades arguing with these people, and it's these little intramural skirmishes. But you were mentioning science, for example. I've been criticized by some anarchists for providing an open forum for scientific and medical and historical heretics. For example, if somebody has a point of view that from a scientific perspective is considered heresy, from a historical or from a heterodox historical or orthodox historical interpretation of history is considered heresy, or from a medical perspective is considered heresy, I still want to hear what they have to say.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to contentious moral views, I'm not really into the animal rights thing, for example, but people who believe in vegetarianism or veganism for animal rights reasons or whatever kind of reasons, fine, I'm all for hearing their point of view. Same thing with the pro-life point of view. I want to hear what their beliefs are and why they believe this. And you do find some anarchists that are into they're more interested in being leftist fundamentalists than they are in being interested in.
Well, it's a complete contradiction in terms. I mean, a true anarchist wants to welcome all individual views into the discussion. I mean, it's the classic Greek Socratic method, where everything is, there's a round table discussion, everything stays in that system. It's Talmudic also. The Talmud is like that. All the different people got to say stuff that's completely contradictory. It all is there. And then, it's a trusting of the individual to govern themselves, to determine what's right. I view that's what talk radio should be all about. That's what I try to do. I have people on from all views. I try to debate or discuss. They'll let the listeners decide what's right, what's real. Anyways, Keith, we're reaching toward the end of the program, so I'd like you to let my listeners and viewers know how they could get more information about you and about your works and your books or anything else you want to talk about.
Well, if you just Google my name, Keith Preston, you can find all kinds of things about me on the internet, including what my enemies and critics have to say about me. But you can read all that stuff and make up your mind for yourself. But there's a website, attackthesystem.com. It's the same title as the book, Attack the System. And that book, that website has it's an old website. It's been online for about 20 years. So there are literally thousands and thousands of blog posts there and essays and things like that, as well as I have about half a dozen books, and you can order those from the website. I think there are links that take you directly to Amazon.com, or you can order them from the publisher. The publisher is called Black House Publishing, that's based in London. Either one of those is fine. So, if you really want to get deep into my work, I have about half a dozen books that are available, and then probably hundreds of essays and thousands of blog posts. And there are also a lot of podcasts that I've done over the years. I used to do a podcast for Attack the System. I'm doing another one now that's deals with more mainstream news issues and pop culture issues, like it's called Kick the Puppy. And then I'm also a commentator for a number of international media outlets, primarily Press TV, but I've also been on Russia Today and Sputnik and some of those. So just Google my name and you can find all kinds of interviews and podcasts and interviews of radio interviews, television interviews, podcasts that I've done personally where I'm actually the host, writings of mine, books, all of these kinds of things are available.
All right, great. Listen, Keith, I'll put a link up to my YouTube channel for your site as well. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, Keith, take care.
Likewise.
All right.